Remember the world before we were all intimately familiar with airport security?
Oh, yeah.
Before we knew the TSA pre-check line like the back of our hand.
Yeah.
It might feel like a lifetime ago, but it all changed pretty drastically because of one man, Richard Reed, butcher
Right.
bomber, and his attempt to bring down an airplane just months after 9/11.
It really is remarkable how a single event,
Yeah.
even a failed one, can have such a profound impact on our lives. And Reed's story,
Mm.
despite its seemingly amateurish nature, is a perfect example of how fear and security theater became so deeply ingrained in our society.
Today we're going to unpack the story of Richard Reed, how he got involved with radical Islam and the incredible chain of events that unfolded on that transatlantic flight. We've got court documents, firsthand accounts from passengers and crew, and even interviews with Reed himself from prison.
Wow. And what's fascinating about diving into this story now, all these years later, is that it allows us to examine the long-term consequences of that day, the rise of security measures like taking off our shoes, the expansion of surveillance, and the ongoing debate over whether these measures truly make us safer.
So let's rewind back to December 2001. The world is still raw from the trauma of 9/11. The anthrax scare is unfolding, and there's a palpable sense of fear and uncertainty hanging in the air. What's next? Was a question on everyone's mind.
And into this climate of anxiety steps Richard Reed,
Right.
a young British man with a troubled past who becomes the embodiment of those very fears.
Reed's story is a complicated one, and to understand his path to radicalization, we need to start at the beginning. He grew up in London, a mixed-race kid from a broken home. His father, Robin, was in and out of jail for petty theft, leaving Reed with a sense of instability and a lack of direction.
What's interesting is that Robin, while in prison, converted to Islam. And he actually encouraged Richard to do the same if he ever found himself behind bars.
Wait, really?
Yeah,
That's a strange piece of advice.
it might seem odd, but Robin's reasoning was actually quite pragmatic. He saw converting to Islam as a way for Richard to navigate the harsh realities of prison life, to have access to better food, find a sense of community, and gain a bit of protection within the prison system.
So it wasn't necessarily about a deep spiritual conversion for Robin, but rather a strategic move to improve his son's chances of survival in a difficult environment.
Exactly. And this pragmatic approach to faith is something that becomes relevant later on as we explore Richard's own journey into Islam and his eventual embrace of radical ideology, because it suggests that his initial attraction to Islam may have been driven more by a desire for belonging and purpose rather than a fervent religious conviction.
That's a really interesting point. It sets the stage for a more nuanced understanding of his motivations. It wasn't just a sudden turn towards extremism, but a gradual process shaped by the people and ideologies he encountered along the way.
Precisely. And to trace that journey, we need to look at the key influences that shaped his worldview, starting with his exposure to radical preachers and extremist networks within the London mosque scene.
Okay, so he starts out attending moderate mosques, but eventually ends up at the infamous Finsbury Park Mosque, a place known for its extremist views and connections to terrorist organizations.
The Finsbury Park Mosque was, at that time, a hotbed of radicalization. It attracted individuals who were disillusioned and angry, seeking answers in the rhetoric of jihad and anti-Western sentiment. Reed was exposed to influential figures there, clerics preaching violent resistance individuals who would later be linked to the 9/11 attacks.
It's chilling to think that he was immersed in that environment, soaking up those messages of hate and violence.
Yeah.
But what's even more perplexing is that a lot of his activities during this period remain shrouded in mystery.
Yes, much of Reed's travel and training is difficult to verify. We know he traveled extensively to Pakistan, likely into Afghanistan, and then through various countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Some sources claim he trained at a specific al-Qaeda camp. Others connect him to a shadowy bomb maker. But a lot of this information is based on unreliable sources, things like detainee interrogations at Guantanamo Bay, so it's hard to separate fact from fiction.
It's like trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. We get these glimpses into his movements, but the full picture remains elusive.
And this lack of clarity actually contributes to the narrative surrounding Richard Reed. It fuels speculation, allowing both sides of the spectrum to paint him as either a bumbling incompetent or a mastermind terrorist.
Which brings us to the infamous shoe bomb itself. Was he some kind of explosives expert who cooked this thing up on his own?
Most experts believe that Reed likely did not have the technical skills or resources to construct the shoe bomb himself. There's debate about where it originated, with some theories pointing to Afghanistan, others to Paris, but it's highly improbable that he was the mastermind behind its construction.
So if he didn't make it, who did?
The prevailing theory is that the concept and the actual device were likely provided by higher-ups in al-Qaeda. This was not some rogue operation concocted by a lone wolf. This was a carefully planned attempt, albeit with an operative who, let's just say, wasn't exactly James Bond.
Which leads to the question, how did this plot, which seems almost farcical in retrospect, even get as far as it did?
Well, it's important to remember that this was just 2 months after 9/11 airport security, as we knew it was in its infancy. There were no standardized protocols, no TSA pre-check, no full-body scanners. It was a reactive system still trying to adapt to this new era of terrorism.
So a lot of it was basically improvised.
Essentially, yes. And Reed's initial attempt to board the flight from Paris highlights just how chaotic and vulnerable the system was at that time.
You're talking about the incident where he was initially denied boarding.
Exactly. He shows up at the airport looking disheveled, acting suspiciously, pays in cash, has no luggage. He's basically ticking every box on the suspicious traveler checklist.
It's almost comical. You'd think someone would have noticed.
You would think so, but they let him go. It's a testament to the fact that despite heightened anxieties, security protocols were still lagging behind the evolving threat.
So Reed misses his flight, presumably calls his handlers, gets a try-again pep talk, and the next day he's back at the airport ready for round 2. This time with those infamous shoes.
And this time he manages to board the plane, but even then his attempt to detonate the shoe bomb is, to put it mildly, a series of blunders.
Okay, this is where the story takes a wild turn. Paint us a picture of what happens on that flight.
Imagine this. You're on a transatlantic flight, and there's this guy acting strangely. He's refusing food and water, sweating profusely, fidgeting in his seat. And then he pulls out a match and tries to light something in his shoe.
Not exactly subtle, is he?
Not at all. And thankfully, the flight attendants are paying attention. They notice his bizarre behavior, confront him about the match, and that's when they discover the fuse sticking out of his shoe.
And that's when things get really intense, right?
Absolutely. What ensues is a chaotic struggle. Reed bites one of the flight attendants. There's screaming panic, a desperate attempt to restrain him. And it's the passengers and crew with no special training who become the heroes of this story.
It sounds like something straight out of an action movie. This ragtag group of passengers and crew taking down a would-be terrorist with whatever they can get their hands on.
It's a testament to human instinct and resilience in the face of danger. They used belts, headphone cords, anything they could find to subdue him. And amidst the chaos, someone decides to put on a movie to try and calm everyone down.
Now that's an interesting detail, given the time period. I'm guessing they went with something patriotic? Maybe Independence Day.
Surprisingly, no. The movie they chose was Legally Blonde.
Legally Blonde. Seriously. That's amazing.
It is. It speaks to our need for normalcy, our desire to find comfort in the familiar, even when surrounded by extraordinary circumstances.
Okay, so the plane makes an emergency landing in Boston. Reed is arrested, and the world breathes a collective sigh of relief. But here's where things get a little complicated. The initial charges against Reed don't even mention terrorism.
Right. He was initially charged with assaulting the flight attendants and interfering with their duties. This was likely a strategic move by the FBI, possibly using a loophole in the recently passed Patriot Act.
The Patriot Act? What does that have to do with Reed's case?
The Patriot Act, passed just weeks after 9/11, expanded the government's surveillance powers and allowed for the indefinite detention of non-citizens suspected of terrorism. However, to hold someone indefinitely, they had to be charged with a crime within 7 days.
So by initially charging Reed with assault, they could buy themselves some time to build a stronger case for terrorism charges.
Exactly. It was a legal maneuver that reflects the anxieties and uncertainties of that post-9/11 world. Everyone was grappling with how to respond to this new threat, and the legal framework was still being developed.
And of course, this delay in charging him with terrorism only fueled media speculation. Was he a bumbling idiot who never stood a chance, or a dangerous extremist who nearly brought down a plane?
The narrative became polarized, with both sides using Reed's case to support their own agendas. Then Attorney General John Ashcroft, for example, used the incident to promote the Patriot Act, highlighting the need for increased surveillance and expanded powers. He portrayed the passengers and crew as everyday heroes, essentially air marshals, emphasizing the idea that everyone needs to be vigilant in the fight against terrorism.
And this is where we see the seeds of security theater being sown.
Precisely. The notion that we all need to be constantly on guard, suspicious of our fellow travelers, ready to intervene at a moment's notice.
Which brings us to the most enduring legacy of the shoe bomb attempt, the now ubiquitous practice of taking off our shoes at airport security.
It's remarkable, isn't it, how this single event, a failed attempt by a seemingly inept individual, led to a security measure that has become so ingrained in our travel routines.
For years, it was encouraged, but not mandatory. But then in 2006, citing intelligence pointing to a continuing threat from shoe bombs, it became official. Everyone had to take off their shoes.
And yet, despite these warnings, no other shoe bomber has ever been caught. It raises the question, is this measure truly effective, or is it simply a form of security theater that provides a false sense of security while infringing on our privacy and convenience?
It's a question worth pondering. But let's not forget about Richard Reed himself. He's been in Supermax prison ever since his arrest, serving multiple life sentences. He remains unrepentant, clinging to his extremist beliefs.
He's a complex figure representing a confluence of factors that led him down this path. Social alienation, a search for belonging, exposure to extremist ideology, and perhaps a lack of critical thinking skills. His story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of extremism and the lasting impact of fear, even when that fear is based on a threat that ultimately proved to be inept.
So what can we take away from this deep dive into the story of Richard Reed and the shoe bomb attempt? He may have failed to bring down an airplane, but he succeeded in changing the way we travel forever. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the trade-offs we're willing to make in the name of security. Are we truly safer taking off our shoes, or are we simply perpetuating a culture of fear and suspicion? These are questions we need to continue to ask ourselves as we navigate the ever-evolving landscape of security threats.
And it's important to remember that security is not just about measures and protocols. It's also about understanding the root causes of extremism and addressing the factors that make individuals susceptible to radicalization.
Absolutely. We need to be vigilant, but we also need to be thoughtful and critical. We can't allow fear to dictate our actions or erode our freedoms. That's the true lesson to be learned from the story of Richard Reed and the legacy of the shoe bomb. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the story of the shoe bomber and the rise of security theater. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. Don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations of the events that shape our world. Until next time, stay curious.